The dust devils spiraled across the main street of Sage Creek, Arizona Territory, on a scorching afternoon in late August, 1887. When the Apache woman arrived with prophetic words that would forever divide the town between true believers and determined skeptics, she appeared as if materialized from the shimmering desert heat itself. Walking calmly down the wooden sidewalk while other residents sought desperate shade from the relentless sun that had been mercilessly baking the territory for weeks without the slightest hint of mercy or relief. Aiyana was perhaps 40 years old, though the harsh desert had weathered her face in ways that made precise aging impossible for any observer. Her long, silver-streaked hair was intricately braided with sacred eagle feathers and precious turquoise beads that caught and reflected the harsh sunlight like tiny mirrors. She wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with practical frontier elements, fine buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories of her people, but also sturdy leather boots suitable for long desert travel and survival. Most striking were her eyes, dark and penetrating, that seemed to see far beyond the immediate present into realms that others could not perceive. Jake Morrison stood on the wooden porch of his general store, wiping beads of sweat from his weathered forehead as he watched the Apache woman approach with purposeful steps. Jake was a practical man in his early 30s who had built his successful business on hard work, honest dealing, and common sense. He had little patience for superstition or mysticism, preferring to deal with the tangible realities of commerce, inventory, and the daily challenges of frontier life that demanded logical solutions. When Aiyana stopped directly in front of his store and fixed those penetrating eyes on him, Jake felt an involuntary chill despite the oppressive heat. "You are the merchant, Jake Morrison," she said in clear, unaccented English. "The one who speaks for this town when the mayor is away." "I'm just a storekeeper, ma'am," Jake replied cautiously, "but I suppose people do come to me with their problems sometimes. What can I do for you?" Aiyana surveyed the dusty street, the wooden buildings baking in the sun, the few townspeople moving slowly in the heat. Her expression was grave, almost sorrowful. "I have come with a warning that will save lives, if you have the wisdom to listen and the courage to act." Jake's natural skepticism immediately kicked in. In his experience, people who claimed to have supernatural knowledge usually wanted something: money, food, or simply attention. But something about Aiyana's demeanor gave him pause. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being believed. "What kind of warning?" "The great water is coming," Aiyana said simply. "In 7 days, when the moon is dark, the angry spirits of the sky will send floods that will wash away everything in this valley. Every building, every person who remains here will be swept into the desert to die." Jake stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. The idea seemed absurd. Sage Creek was located in one of the most arid regions of the territory. The last significant rainfall had been months ago, and the few streams that crossed the valley had been reduced to dry creek beds filled with nothing but dust and stones. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're in the middle of the worst drought in living memory. There's been no rain for 3 months. The idea of flood seems—" Jake searched for a diplomatic way to express his disbelief. "Impossible," Aiyana finished for him. "That is what makes it a prophecy rather than simple observation. I see what has not yet come to pass." Word of the Apache woman's prophecies spread through Sage Creek like wildfire. By evening, a crowd had gathered outside Jake's store, some curious, others openly skeptical, a few genuinely frightened. The town's population was small enough that unusual events became community discussions very quickly. "This is nonsense," declared Doc Patterson, the town's physician and most educated resident. Meteorologically speaking, there's no possibility of significant precipitation in the current atmospheric conditions. This woman is either delusional or deliberately spreading panic. Maybe so, said Sarah Collins, the school teacher. But what if she's right? What if there's something we don't understand about the weather patterns here? You can't be serious, Doc Patterson scoffed. You're talking about believing in supernatural fortune-telling over scientific observation. Jake found himself caught between his rational instincts and a growing unease he couldn't quite explain. Aiyana, he called to the Apache woman, who had been listening to the debate with patient calm. You say you can see the future? Can you prove it? Can you show us something that will happen before this flood you're predicting? Aiyana nodded slowly. Tomorrow at noon, when the sun is highest, the old cottonwood tree beside the church will lose its largest branch. The branch will fall toward the east, blocking the path to the cemetery. It was a specific, verifiable prediction. Jake felt some relief. At least they would have a way to test her claims before the supposedly catastrophic flood. And in 3 days, Aiyana continued, the Johnson family's well will run dry, though it has never failed before. Mrs. Johnson will find a dead snake at the bottom when her husband climbs down to investigate. More murmurs ran through the crowd. The Johnson well was considered the most reliable water source in town, fed by what everyone believed was an inexhaustible underground spring. These are tests, Aiyana explained. Small signs that will prove the truth of the greater vision. If these things happen, as I have foreseen, you will know that the great water is real and you must prepare. The next day at noon, Jake and half the town gathered around the old cottonwood tree. It was a massive specimen, easily 100 years old, that had weathered countless desert storms. Its largest branch stretched out over the path to the cemetery, thick and seemingly solid. At exactly 12 o'clock, with no wind and no apparent cause, the branch groaned once and crashed to the ground, falling precisely toward the east, just as Aiyana had predicted. The impact shook the ground and completely blocked the cemetery path. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Doc Patterson examined the fallen branch, looking for signs of disease or damage that might explain the sudden failure, but found none. Coincidence, he muttered. But his voice lacked its previous conviction. Jake felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. One accurate prediction could indeed be coincidence, but it was unsettling nonetheless. 3 days later, Mrs. Johnson's well ran dry for the first time in living memory. When her husband descended into the well to investigate, he found exactly what Aiyana had predicted. A dead rattlesnake coiled at the bottom, apparently having fallen in and been unable to escape. By this point, the town was divided into 3 camps. True believers who were ready to evacuate immediately. Absolute skeptics who insisted on rational explanations for everything. And a growing middle group of worried fence-sitters who were beginning to think that perhaps they should at least consider the possibility that Aiyana might be right about the flood. Jake found himself reluctantly moving toward the believer camp, not because he had suddenly embraced mysticism, but because the practical consequences of ignoring a real warning were too serious to risk. Aiyana, he said, approaching her where she had set up a small camp on the outskirts of town. Assuming your prediction about the flood is accurate, what exactly are you suggesting we do? We can't just abandon the town on the word of... He paused, trying to find a respectful way to phrase his skepticism. On the word of an Apache woman who claims to see the future, Aiyana finished with a slight smile. I understand your dilemma, Jake Morrison. Let me tell you something that may help you decide. She gestured for him to sit beside her small fire. The flames danced in her dark eyes as she spoke. When I was a child, my grandmother taught me to read the signs that the land gives us. Not magic, not spirits speaking in dreams, but the actual language of the earth itself, the way animals behave, the color of the sky at certain times, the feel of the wind, the smell of the air. Jake listened carefully, intrigued by this more naturalistic explanation. For weeks, I have been watching the signs. Birds flying in unusual patterns, insects gathering in places they never gather, the way the morning mist forms in the canyons. These are not supernatural omens. They are the Earth's way of preparing for something that has not yet arrived. You're saying you're not really seeing the future? Jake asked, confused. I am reading patterns that most people do not know how to read. To your people, it appears to be magic. To my people, it is simply knowledge passed down through generations of careful observation. Aiyana stood and pointed toward the distant mountains. Far to the north, where the great storms are born, there's been unusual rainfall for days. The water is collecting in places where it cannot be seen from here, but it is building pressure like water behind a dam. When that pressure becomes too great, it will find the path of least resistance down through the valleys. And that path leads here, directly here. This valley is a natural channel that will become a raging river when the northern waters are released. Your ancestors chose to build here because it seemed safe, a dry, flat area protected by surrounding hills. But those same hills will funnel the flood directly through your town. Jake studied her face, looking for any sign of deception or delusion. What he saw instead was someone sharing knowledge gained through a lifetime of careful observation and learning. Why should I believe you instead of Doc Pedersen? He has scientific training, education, from back east. Because Doc Pedersen has book knowledge about weather in general. I have specific knowledge about weather in this place. My people have lived in this region for 1,000 years. We know how water moves through these valleys because we have survived floods before. That evening, Jake called a town meeting. He presented Aiyana's explanation, focusing on the practical rather than the mystical elements of her predictions. She's not claiming magic, he told the assembled townspeople. She's claiming knowledge, the kind of environmental awareness that comes from generations of living in close harmony with the land. The question is whether we're willing to bet our lives that she's wrong. Doc Patterson remained unconvinced. Even if she has some legitimate weather knowledge, the scale of flooding she's describing would require an unprecedented meteorological event. I maintain that evacuation based on unverifiable claims is irresponsible panic. But what if she's right? Sarah Collins asked, what if we stay and the flood comes? What if we could have saved lives but chose not to because we were too proud to listen to knowledge that didn't come from a textbook? The debate continued 4 hours. Finally, Jake proposed a compromise. Those who want to leave have 2 days to prepare for evacuation. Those who want to stay are free to stay, but everyone should at least move their most valuable possessions to higher ground, just as a precaution. Over the next 2 days, about half the town made preparations to leave temporarily. They moved livestock, important documents, and precious family items to elevated locations outside the valley. Some families departed entirely, seeking shelter with relatives in distant towns. Jake himself was torn. His entire livelihood was tied up in his store and its inventory. Abandoning everything based on an Apache woman's weather predictions went against every practical instinct he possessed. But something about Aiyana's quiet certainty had convinced him that the risk was real. On the sixth night, the night before the predicted flood, Jake made his decision. A would stay, but he would take precautions. He moved his most valuable merchandise to the second floor of his building and prepared an emergency evacuation route. Aiyana appeared at his store as he was securing the last of his goods. "You are wise to prepare, but foolish to remain," she told him. "This is my life," Jake replied. "Everything I've worked for is here. I can't just walk away from it. Things can be replaced. Lives cannot. What about you? If this flood is as dangerous as you say, why are you still here?" Aiyana's expression became grave. "Because I must bear witness. If am doblewen, I must face the consequences of causing unnecessary fear. If I'm right, someone must survive to tell the story, so that future generations will listen when the signs appear again." That night, neither Jake nor Aiyana slept. They sat on the porch of his store, watching the clear, star-filled sky and listening to the unnatural silence that had settled over the desert. Just after midnight, Tay heard a distant rumbling like thunder that went on and on without stopping. The sound grew steadily louder, accompanied by a wind that carried an unfamiliar smell of distant rain. "It comes," Aiyana said simply. By dawn, they could see it, a wall of muddy water, 30 feet high, roaring down the valley, carrying trees, boulders, and the debris of everything in its path. The flood struck Sage Creek with the force of a liquid avalanche, destroying every building in its path and transforming the quiet frontier town into a raging torrent in a matter of minutes. Jake and Aiyana had climbed to the highest point they could find, the bell tower of the church, and watched in awe and terror as the prediction became devastating reality. The flood lasted for 3 hours, after which the water receded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a landscape of mud and destruction. When rescue parties arrived from neighboring towns, they found Jake and Aiyana among the survivors who had heeded the warning. Those who had evacuated returned to find their homes gone, but their lives intact. Those who had remained and been caught by the flood were not so fortunate. In the aftermath, as the town began the long process of rebuilding, Jake sought out Aiyana to ask the question that had been haunting him. "How did you really know the specific timing, the exact path of the flood? Was it truly just environmental observation?" Aiyana smiled. "Jake Morrison, you want to understand the difference between knowledge and magic? Let me tell you a secret that my grandmother shared with me. The most powerful magic is simply understanding things that others have not yet learned to see. So it was knowledge. It was knowledge so deep and detailed that it appeared to be magic to those who did not possess it. Your people have forgotten how to listen to the earth's voice. My people never forgot." Years later, when Jake had rebuilt his store and his life, he would tell the story of the Apache woman who saved Sage Creek through what she called prophecy, but what he came to understand was simply wisdom. The difference between magic and science, he realized, was often just a matter of perspective and understanding. Aiyana's prediction had saved dozens of lives and taught an entire community that knowledge comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most valuable wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. The flood had washed away their buildings, but it had also washed away some of their prejudices and preconceptions, leaving room for a deeper appreciation of the complex ways that humans can understand and interact with the natural world.